The courtroom was silent. The judge, a stern-faced man with piercing eyes, leaned forward, his gavel tapping lightly against the desk. Across from him stood a young black boy, barely 16, dressed in an oversized suit that swallowed his frame. Yet, his posture was unwavering, his gaze sharp. A slow, amused smile crept across the judge's face as he adjusted his glasses. "All right, young man," he said, his voice thick with condescension. "Let's play a game. Truth or lie?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. But the boy didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the judge's with an unsettling certainty. He said. The wooden walls of the courtroom seemed to press inward, the tension so thick it could be sliced. The audience leaned forward in their seats, barely breathing, as if afraid they might shatter the fragile moment balancing between the judge and the boy. Judge Robert Hensley adjusted his tie, his fingers grazing the polished wood of his gavel. He had seen countless defendants in his courtroom, liars, thieves, criminals, but never one quite like this. This boy, this Temple Carter, was something else entirely. The judge's smile widened as he spoke again, the words dripping with amusement. "Let's start with something simple." He steepled his fingers. "The law states that a person is innocent until proven guilty. Truth or lie?" Temple's face remained unreadable. No hesitation, no nervous twitch. Just a quiet certainty as he answered. "Lie." A sharp gasp echoed through the room. The judge's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he let out a short chuckle. "Oh." He leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "Would you care to explain that?" Temple's voice was steady. "Because in reality, people, especially people like me, are assumed guilty first and have to prove their innocence." The silence that followed was different now. It was heavier, more dangerous. Judge Hensley's expression darkened. His amusement had not only faded, it had curdled. He glanced toward the prosecutor, then the jury, as if weighing his next move. "Interesting perspective," he said at last, his voice noticeably cooler. "But let's try another." He tapped his gavel lightly. The judge must be completely fair and unbiased in every case. Truth or lie? This time, a flicker of something crossed Temple's face, something knowing. Lie. The judge's jaw tightened. "Explain." "Because judges are human," Temple replied smoothly, his hands clasped in front of him. "And humans have biases, whether they admit it or not." He tilted his head slightly. "You, for example, assumed I was just a kid who didn't know what he was talking about. That's your bias." A murmur of whispers spread through the courtroom. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously in their notepads, cameras clicking. The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. "Order," he barked, his voice sharper than before. Temple didn't flinch. He stood his ground as the room settled again, his sharp brown eyes still locked on the judge. Hensley exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses. He had underestimated this boy. That much was clear. But the game wasn't over yet. Not even close. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The murmur of voices had turned into something heavier, something almost tangible. Judge Hensley had lost the easy confidence with which he had started his game. His fingers tapped absently against the desk, a rhythm of irritation disguised as thoughtfulness. He had expected to toy with the boy, to remind him of his place. Instead, he found himself studying Temple Carter as if he were a puzzle with missing pieces. Temple, for his part, remained motionless. He had not smiled, had not shown any flicker of triumph. He simply stood, hands at his sides, waiting. His posture was not the nervous stance of a teenager on trial, but the quiet stillness of a man who had seen the outcome long before the game had even begun. The judge cleared his throat, his voice measured. "You seem very sure of yourself, Mr. Carter." Temple blinked once. "That's because I am." A scoff came from the prosecutor's table, breaking the stillness. Ethan Calloway, the state's sharp-jawed, seasoned attorney, leaned forward with a smirk. "Your Honor, if I may, this young man has had his fun, but we do have a case to present." Judge Hensley's lips pressed together in something that might have been relief. He nodded. "Proceed." Calloway stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit before pacing toward the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, let's bring our attention back to why we're here." His voice was confident, practiced. Temple Carter is not here because of a debate on justice. He is here because he was found near the scene of a robbery, a crime in which the suspect was described as a young black male wearing a dark hoodie. Temple remained still. He had heard this all before. Calloway continued, gesturing toward the screen behind him. We have surveillance footage placing him in the area just minutes before the break-in. The grainy black and white video flickered to life. A figure, faceless, indistinct, walked down the street. It could have been anyone. Calloway turned back to the room, his confidence unwavering. And we have an eyewitness who identified him. A rustle of papers. The courtroom doors opened, and a middle-aged woman was led in. She clutched her purse tightly, her eyes darting around the room as if unsure of her own presence. Calloway smiled, reassuring. Miss Adams, thank you for being here today. You were present at the scene of the crime, correct? She nodded hesitantly. Yes, sir. And can you confirm that the person you saw that night is in this courtroom? Temple watched as she hesitated. Just for a second. Barely noticeable. But it was there. Her eyes flicked toward him. Then, almost reluctantly, she nodded. Yes, I think so. Temple inhaled slowly. There it was. The doubt. The uncertainty. But doubt was dangerous when spoken in a courtroom like this. Doubt could be shaped into confidence with the right words. Calloway's smile widened. No further questions. Temple turned his head toward the defense table. His lawyer, public defender Daniel Graves, looked unimpressed. Graves had been assigned to him, an overworked attorney with too many cases and too little patience. He flipped through his notes without urgency, then stood, adjusting his tie. Miss Adams, Graves began, his voice smooth but pointed. You say you think the person you saw is my client. Are you absolutely certain? She shifted slightly. I mean, he looks like him. Graves lifted a brow. Looks like him. Well, yes. In what way? The woman hesitated again, gripping her purse tighter. Well, I remember the hoodie. And he had the same skin color. Graves exhaled. I see. So what you're telling us is that the suspect was described as a black male in a hoodie, and since my client is also a black male who sometimes wears a hoodie, you assumed it must be him. Calloway shifted uncomfortably. Miss Adams' expression flickered with something uncertain. I didn't assume, I just... Graves held up a hand. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. We will continue after a brief recess. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted into movement. Reporters murmured to each other, cameras flashed, and the quiet buzz of conversation filled the space. Temple turned, stepping toward the defense table, but before he could reach it, a hand clamped around his shoulder. He turned, meeting the cold stare of Captain Walter Burke. The man's grip was firm, just a shade too tight. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Got a minute, Carter. Burke's voice was low, edged with something unreadable. Temple didn't react. Do I have a choice? Burke's lips twitched. Not really. The captain led him to the far side of the room, away from the reporters, away from the noise. He let go of Temple's shoulder, but kept his stance imposing. You've got quite the mouth on you, Burke muttered. Smart kid, huh? Temple didn't answer. Burke's jaw tightened. Listen to me, kid. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you're out of your depth. These people. He gestured vaguely toward the judge's bench, the prosecutor's table. They don't like being embarrassed. You push too hard, you make them look bad, and they'll bury you. Temple met his gaze, unblinking. Are you threatening me? Burke scoffed. I'm giving you advice. Play the game. Take the deal when it comes. Temple tilted his head slightly. That sounds an awful lot like a warning. Burke leaned in just enough that his breath was close. Call it whatever you want. Just be smart enough to hear it. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Burke turned and walked away, disappearing into the moving bodies of the courtroom. Temple exhaled slowly. His mind was already working, already calculating. The pieces were moving now. The game wasn't just between him and Judge Hensley anymore. It was bigger than that. And if Captain Burke thought a few words of intimidation were enough to make him fold, he was wrong. Temple Carter sat alone at the defense table, his fingers pressed together in quiet contemplation. The murmur of voices in the courtroom had settled into a low hum, distant but present, like the ocean before a storm. He wasn't rattled by Captain Burke's warning. If anything, it had confirmed what he already suspected. This case was bigger than just him. He had read enough about the law to understand that truth alone wasn't always enough to win. The justice system wasn't about justice. It was about control, about perception, about making people believe what was convenient. And right now, it was convenient for them to believe that Temple Carter was guilty. When the judge called for the court to reconvene, the room settled. The weight of scrutiny pressed down on him, but Temple refused to let it show. He met the judge's gaze with the same steady resolve. Judge Hensley leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Calloway, you may proceed." The prosecutor straightened his tie, exuding confidence as he stepped forward. "Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the state would like to introduce additional evidence that supports our case against the defendant." Temple's eyes didn't waver as the screen behind Calloway flickered to life again. Another video. This time, it was street footage, clearer than before, showing a figure moving quickly down an alley. The footage was grainy, but the shape was undeniable. A hooded silhouette. The timestamp in the corner placed it minutes before the robbery occurred. Calloway turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you see here is the defendant in close proximity to the crime scene just before the robbery took place. This," he gestured toward the screen, letting the image linger, "is a crucial piece of evidence linking Mr. Carter to this crime." Temple barely blinked. He was already calculating, already looking for the flaws. Calloway continued, pacing the courtroom like a man who had already won. "Now, the defense may argue that this video is inconclusive, that it doesn't prove Mr. Carter was inside the store. But let's use logic, shall we? Why was he there? Why was he in that alley at that exact moment?" Temple could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. The prosecutor was shaping a narrative. It didn't matter that the video didn't prove anything. It planted the right kind of doubt, and that was all they needed. Graves, his assigned defense attorney, rose lazily from his chair, adjusting his sleeves. "Objection. Circumstantial." Judge Hensley waved a dismissive hand. "Overruled." Temple wasn't surprised. This courtroom was never built for him to win. Calloway, clearly satisfied, stepped back. No further questions. Judge Hensley turned his attention to the defense. "Mr. Graves, you may cross-examine." Graves sighed, rubbing his temple before standing again. Temple knew immediately his attorney wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting just enough to say he had tried. He cleared his throat. "Officer Reynolds, the footage we just saw, this was taken from a city surveillance camera, correct?" A uniformed officer nodded from the witness stand. "Yes." Graves paced lazily. "And this footage has been analyzed by law enforcement?" "Yes, sir." Temple watched the exchange carefully, feeling the creeping frustration build in his chest. Graves was wasting time with empty questions. Questions that didn't matter, questions that didn't challenge anything. The so-called cross-examination was over in less than 2 minutes. When Graves sat back down, he didn't even glance at Temple. It was clear he was done putting in effort. Temple inhaled slowly. Judge Hensley folded his hands. "Does the defense have any further witnesses or evidence to present at this time?" Graves was already shaking his head. "Not at this moment, Your Honor." Temple could feel it, the slow closing of the walls around him. This was how they buried people. Not in grand, dramatic moments, but in small, calculated decisions. In complacency. In the quiet surrender of a man who had long since stopped believing the fight was worth it. But Temple wasn't Graves. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. Judge Hensley's eyes flicked to him, irritation barely concealed behind a veil of professionalism. "Mr. Carter." Temple's voice was clear. "I'd like to request permission to represent myself." The courtroom shifted. There was an audible murmur. Graves' head snapped toward him, his expression a mix of shock and exasperation. Judge Hensley frowned. "Excuse me. I'd like to act as my own attorney," Temple repeated. His posture remained steady, even as the air in the room thickened. Graves leaned toward him, lowering his voice. "Are you out of your mind?" Temple didn't look at him. "I have the right to request self-representation." Judge Hensley exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Mr. Carter, I highly suggest you reconsider." Temple's voice didn't waver. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I didn't ask for a suggestion. I asked for my right." Silence. Hensley regarded him, his jaw tight. Then, after a long pause, he sighed. "Step forward." Temple obeyed, approaching the judge's bench. Hensley's eyes burned into him. You understand what you're doing? If you proceed with this, there are no do-overs. No appeals claiming ineffective counsel. Temple nodded. I understand. The judge studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, at last, he leaned back in his chair. Very well. He tapped his gavel once. The court grants the defendant's request for self-representation. A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Temple turned back toward the crowd, his pulse steady. This was it. This was the moment the case shifted. They had expected him to play defense, to accept what was given to him. But they had underestimated him. And now he had just changed the game. The courtroom settled into a silence that felt heavier than before. Temple Carter remained standing at the defense table, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Yet he showed no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty. He had just taken control of his own fate, and now all eyes were on him. Judge Hensley studied him carefully, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of the bench. There was something unreadable in his gaze, annoyance, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of respect, though it was buried beneath layers of authority. Temple could feel the shift in the room. Before, he had been just another defendant, another name on a case file, another black kid they expected to fold under pressure. Now he was something else. A wild card. An anomaly they hadn't planned for. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, since you have chosen to represent yourself, you may proceed with your cross-examination. Temple stepped forward, his pulse steady. This was his first real move. Calloway, the prosecutor, had been building a foundation of circumstantial evidence, hoping the weight of implication would be enough. But Temple understood the game now. The goal wasn't to fight their arguments directly. It was to dismantle their credibility piece by piece. He turned toward the witness stand, where Officer Reynolds sat stiffly in his uniform. The officer's expression was neutral, but there was something else beneath it, something guarded. Temple clasped his hands behind his back, his voice calm. Officer Reynolds, you stated earlier that the surveillance footage places me near the crime scene minutes before the robbery took place. Is that correct? Reynolds nodded. That's correct. Temple tilted his head slightly. Tell me, officer, when was this footage first reviewed? Reynolds blinked, caught slightly off guard by the question. Shortly after the arrest. Temple let the moment hang for a beat. And was this before or after I was identified as a suspect? Reynolds hesitated just long enough for the tension to thicken. After. Temple nodded slowly, as if considering. So just to clarify, the police didn't initially use this footage to identify a suspect. Instead, they arrested me first, then looked for something that could place me at the scene. Is that right? Calloway shifted in his seat. Objection, Your Honor. Temple didn't look away from Reynolds. Withdrawn. He didn't need an answer. The jury had already heard it. He took a slow step forward. Now, officer, you also mentioned that an eyewitness, Miss Adams, placed me at the scene. Tell me, how was she brought in for questioning? Reynolds straightened slightly. She was interviewed by detectives shortly after the incident. Temple clasped his fingers together. And was she shown a lineup? Reynolds hesitated again. Not exactly. Temple arched a brow. Not exactly. Reynolds cleared his throat. She was shown a series of photos. Temple nodded, his expression unreadable. And my photo was included in those, correct? Reynolds shifted in his seat. Yes. Temple let the pause stretch. So again, to clarify, Miss Adams wasn't given a lineup of potential suspects. She was given a set of photos that already included me, someone the police had already decided to arrest. Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for itself. Temple turned toward the jury, his voice measured. Eyewitness testimony is one of the least reliable forms of evidence. Studies have shown that people misidentify suspects more often than they get them right, especially when under stress. Now, imagine being shown a group of pictures after a crime, no lineup, no process of elimination, just faces that the police have already decided to consider. He let the thought settle before adding, wouldn't that influence how you remember things? A few members of the jury exchanged glances. It wasn't enough to win them over completely, but it was enough to plant the seed of doubt. Temple turned back to Reynolds. One last question, officer. When you reviewed the surveillance footage, did it clearly show my face? Reynolds' jaw tightened. It was a low-quality recording. Temple gave him a small, knowing smile. So the answer is no. Reynolds exhaled sharply through his nose. It was enough to match the description. Temple nodded. Right. A description that was vague, general, and let's be honest, could apply to hundreds of young black men in this city. Judge Hensley's gavel rapped once. Mr. Carter, watch your tone. Temple met his gaze, unreadable. Understood, Your Honor. He stepped back from the witness stand. No further questions. As he returned to his seat, he felt the shift in the room again. The confidence in the prosecution had dimmed, just slightly. The game was changing. Judge Hensley adjusted his glasses. We will take a recess before proceeding with further testimony. The gavel struck the wood, and the courtroom broke into movement. Temple barely made it 3 steps before Calloway appeared beside him. Impressive. Temple didn't look at him. Didn't think I had it in me? Calloway smirked. I think you know exactly what you're doing. But be careful, Carter. His voice dropped slightly. You're making enemies. Temple turned to meet his gaze, his expression unreadable. I'm not afraid of them. Calloway's smirk didn't fade, but something in his eyes sharpened. That's what worries me. With that, he walked away. Temple exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He could feel it now, the weight of something much bigger pressing in on him. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. This was about something much more dangerous. And he wasn't sure if he had just won his first battle, or if he had just started a war. The courthouse hallways were colder than they should have been. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, yet the chill that settled over Temple Carter's skin had nothing to do with the temperature. He walked with measured steps, his mind running through every possible angle, every move he had left to make. His cross-examination had weakened the prosecution's case, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He knew how this worked. The system didn't care about proof. It cared about precedent, about convenience, about control. He was a variable they hadn't planned for, and now they were scrambling to regain the upper hand. As he made his way toward the small break room near the courtroom, his fingers unconsciously brushed against the inside pocket of his suit jacket, where he kept a single folded piece of paper, a document he hadn't used yet. His last resort. He wasn't ready to play that card. Not until he had no choice. The low murmur of voices ahead drew his attention. Temple slowed his pace as he neared the corner, his body instinctively shifting into the shadow of the hallway's curve. He wasn't hiding. Not really. Just listening. I don't care how smart he thinks he is. This ends today. The voice was low, sharp, familiar. Captain Burke. Temple's jaw tightened as he stayed where he was, just out of sight. The voice that responded was quieter, less distinct. Calloway. And what exactly do you propose? The prosecutor sounded annoyed, but not surprised. Burke exhaled sharply. We were supposed to have this wrapped up in the first hour. Kid was supposed to go down easy. Now he's turning this into a damn spectacle. Calloway didn't immediately answer. Temple could picture him, standing there in his perfectly tailored suit, calculating. The man was smart. Too smart to outright agree with whatever Burke was planning. This isn't my fault, Calloway finally said. Your officers were the ones who picked him up with nothing but a weak description and a convenient location. You handed me a case with more holes than evidence. A pause. Then Burke's voice again, lower this time. Then maybe it's time we close those holes. Temple barely blinked, his mind processing those words with sharp clarity. They were going to manipulate the case. Maybe tamper with evidence. Maybe find a witness willing to say exactly what they needed. Maybe even something worse. His pulse remained steady, but he felt it, an understanding settling into his bones. He wasn't just fighting against bias or a flawed system. He was fighting men who knew they were wrong and didn't care. Men who would rather bend reality than admit their mistakes. Calloway sighed. You do whatever you need to, but keep me out of it. I'll argue the case. That's my job. There was a faint sound of footsteps retreating, but Burke stayed where he was. Temple exhaled slowly, soundlessly, before stepping around the corner. Burke didn't flinch. Didn't look surprised. He had known. For a moment, they stood there, facing each other in the dimly lit hallway. The quiet hum of the courthouse filled the space between them. Temple tilted his head slightly. Something on your mind, Captain. Burke's lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. Temple held his gaze. I don't think it's a game. Burke took a step closer, his presence looming but not intimidating. He was a man who had spent his entire career asserting dominance through presence alone. Temple had seen men like him before. Men who thought control was something owed to them. You should walk away, Burke said, his voice low, measured. Take whatever deal they give you. Before this gets worse. Temple didn't move. Worse for who? Burke's gaze darkened. For you. The silence between them stretched, thick with meaning. Temple could feel it, the unspoken weight behind the words. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Burke wasn't bluffing. Temple inhaled slowly, then turned, walking past the captain without another word. He felt Burke's eyes on his back until he disappeared into the break room. When court resumed, the tension was different, more focused. The jury was beginning to notice the cracks. They weren't convinced of Temple's innocence, but they were no longer certain of his guilt either. That was progress. Judge Hensley folded his hands, his expression unreadable. Mr. Carter, you may proceed with your defense. Temple stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. He turned toward the courtroom. I would like to call a witness. Hensley raised a brow. And who would that be? Temple's eyes didn't waver. Detective Jonathan Mills. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The name wasn't one the prosecution had listed. Calloway stood immediately. Your Honor, the defense did not disclose this witness prior to today. We object. Temple kept his voice even. The prosecution didn't disclose the fact that Captain Burke was having private conversations about my case in this very courthouse either. But here we are. The courtroom went still. Judge Hensley studied him carefully, then let out a slow breath. I'll allow it. A bailiff exited the courtroom, returning a few minutes later with a man in his mid-40s. Detective Mills looked like someone who had spent too many years carrying secrets. He took the witness stand with the reluctance of a man who knew he was about to step into something messy. Temple approached, keeping his movements calm, deliberate. Detective Mills, you were one of the officers who reviewed the surveillance footage in my case, correct? Mills hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. Yes. Temple nodded. And was there ever any other suspect considered before my arrest? Mills hesitated longer this time. Not officially. Temple let that hang in the air before speaking again. Unofficially, then. Mills swallowed. His gaze flickered toward Captain Burke, who sat rigid in his seat. There was another individual in the area that night. Another wave of murmurs. Temple's heartbeat remained steady. And did this individual match the description better than I did? Mills exhaled. Yes. Calloway was already rising. Objection. Temple spoke over him, his voice rising just enough to hold control. And yet I was the one arrested. Even though another suspect existed. Even though the footage was unclear. Even though the only witness had doubts. He turned to the jury. Tell me, does that sound like justice to you? Judge Hensley banged his gavel. Enough, Mr. Carter. Temple stepped back. The damage was already done. The jury had heard it. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a setup. And now everyone knew it. The silence in the courtroom stretched long after the gavel's sharp crack faded. It wasn't the usual kind of silence, the expectant hush before another round of legal argument. No, this was different. This was the sound of people beginning to realize that what they had just heard couldn't be ignored. Temple Carter remained standing near the witness stand, his hands steady at his sides. His heartbeat, however, was anything but calm. He had forced the truth into the open. He had done something no public defender would have dared to do. He had made the jury listen. Detective Mills still sat in the witness stand, his fingers gripping the wood as if it might anchor him. His face was tight with hesitation, his shoulders drawn. He had spoken too much already. But Temple wasn't done. Judge Hensley exhaled sharply. Mr. Carter, you will not use this courtroom for theatrics. If you have a point to make it through legal questioning, not grandstanding. Temple barely acknowledged him. His focus was still on Mills. Detective, when was the last time this other suspect was mentioned in official reports? Mills hesitated. I don't know. Temple tilted his head slightly. But you knew about him. You knew there was another possibility. Did you inform the prosecution? Mills shifted. Not directly. Temple let that sink in before continuing. Did you question this suspect? A longer pause. Then, almost reluctantly, no. Temple's jaw tightened. He turned slightly, just enough to let the jury see the controlled anger in his eyes. So let me get this straight. There was someone else who fit the description better. Someone else who could have been responsible. And yet, the police didn't question him, didn't bring him in, didn't even consider him. Calloway, the prosecutor, was already shaking his head. Your Honor, this line of questioning is leading. Temple cut him off, his voice firm but controlled. I'll withdraw the question. But the jury had heard it. That was enough. Temple turned back to Mills. Detective, I have one more question for you. Who made the decision to ignore the other suspect? Mills swallowed, his gaze flickering, just briefly, toward the prosecution table, toward Captain Burke. Then he dropped his eyes to the desk in front of him. I don't know. Temple could hear the lie in his voice. The courtroom could too. Temple exhaled slowly. No further questions. Judge Hensley's gavel came down once. We will recess for 15 minutes. The moment the judge left the bench, the room broke into noise. Temple turned and made his way back to the defense table. He knew he had just made himself a bigger target. He had forced their hands. Burke, Calloway, the entire system built to ensure that people like him didn't win. They wouldn't let this go unanswered. As he reached his seat, a shadow loomed over him. Calloway. The prosecutor leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. You're making a mistake, Carter. Temple didn't look at him. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight back. Calloway exhaled, shaking his head. You really think you're going to change anything? That jury, he flicked his gaze toward them. They don't care about your speeches. They don't care about your so-called evidence. They care about what's easiest to believe. Temple met his eyes, calm and unwavering. And what's easiest to believe isn't always the truth. Calloway hesitated, just for a second. Then he straightened, smoothing out the front of his suit. You should have taken a deal when you had the chance. Temple's fingers curled slightly. I still have a chance. Calloway smirked, but there was something hollow in it. We'll see. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the murmuring crowd. Temple exhaled slowly. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had known that pushing back meant risk. But now the real question wasn't whether or not he could prove his innocence. The real question was whether the system would let him. 15 minutes passed, and the courtroom filled once more. Judge Hensley tapped his gavel, calling for order. Mr. Calloway, does the prosecution have any final evidence to present before closing arguments? Calloway stood. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something Temple didn't trust. Yes, Your Honor, he said smoothly. The state would like to introduce new testimony from an additional witness. Temple stiffened. Judge Hensley frowned. This was not disclosed prior to today. Calloway adjusted his cuffs. Circumstances changed. Temple knew exactly what this was. Burke had made his move. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man was led inside. He was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, dressed in casual but respectable clothing. He took the witness stand with careful, rehearsed movements. Temple had never seen him before in his life. Calloway walked toward the stand. State your name for the record. The man cleared his throat. James Douglas. Temple's jaw tightened. Calloway nodded as if satisfied. Mr. Douglas, were you near the crime scene on the night in question? Douglas glanced at Temple just for a moment before answering. Yes. And what did you see? Douglas inhaled slowly, then turned toward the jury. I saw him. He lifted a finger, pointing directly at Temple. I saw him running away from the store. The room tensed. Temple could feel the weight of 1,000 invisible hands pressing against his chest, trying to suffocate him. He already knew what was happening. This man wasn't a witness. He was a tool. Calloway turned back toward the jury, his expression grim but satisfied. No further questions. Temple clenched his fists under the table. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. They couldn't beat him with logic. They couldn't beat him with real evidence, so they had manufactured it. Judge Hensley turned to him. Mr. Carter, do you wish to cross-examine? Temple exhaled slowly, his pulse steady despite the storm raging inside him. He pushed back his chair and stood. Yes, Your Honor, he said. He walked toward the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps, his mind racing. If he didn't dismantle this now, if he didn't tear this man's testimony apart, everything he had done, everything would be for nothing. He stopped in front of the stand, meeting James Douglas's gaze. The man looked away. Temple's voice was quiet but firm. Mr. Douglas, have we ever met before today? Douglas hesitated, then shook his head. No. Temple tilted his head. Then how exactly did you identify me? Douglas swallowed. I recognized you from the night of the crime. Temple let the lie settle. Then he moved in for the kill. What color was my hoodie? Douglas blinked. What? My hoodie, Temple repeated. You said you saw me. That means you must have seen what I was wearing. Douglas shifted. It was dark. I don't remember exactly. Temple nodded. So you're saying you recognized me, but you don't remember what I was wearing? Douglas hesitated. Temple let his voice drop lower, just enough for the jury to lean in. Or maybe you don't remember, because you never saw me at all. The courtroom held its breath, and Temple Carter took his next step toward victory. The air in the courtroom was thick with unspoken tension. Temple Carter remained perfectly still, his hands resting at his sides, his face calm despite the storm brewing around him. His last question still lingered in the air. James Douglas had not responded. The so-called eyewitness, this man who had just pointed at Temple, claiming to have seen him fleeing the crime scene, was unraveling. He sat there, fingers twitching against the witness stand, his confidence draining with every second of silence. Temple let it stretch, watching the weight of the moment settle over the jury. They were waiting, just as he was. Finally, Douglas swallowed. His voice was thinner now. I remember seeing your face. Temple tilted his head slightly, his expression giving nothing away. But you don't remember what I was wearing? Douglas hesitated. It was dark. Temple nodded. And yet, you claim you saw my face clearly? Douglas shifted in his seat. Temple let his words come slow, measured. Were you shown my photo before today? The man blinked. What? You heard me, Temple said, his voice unwavering. Before stepping into this courtroom, were you shown a photograph of me? Douglas's mouth opened slightly, as if forming an answer, but no words came. He looked toward Calloway, the prosecutor, as if searching for direction. Temple took a step closer, his tone sharpening. Who told you to say it was me? Judge Hensley rapped his gavel. Mr. Carter, I will not tolerate intimidation tactics in my courtroom. Temple didn't flinch. His voice remained steady. I'm just asking a question, Your Honor. The judge gave him a warning look, but didn't push further. Temple turned back to Douglas. Answer the question. Douglas exhaled shakily, his fingers curling against the edge of the stand. I wasn't told anything. Temple took in the way the man's voice trembled, the way his hands wouldn't stay still. He had seen enough police interrogations, read enough trial transcripts to know when someone was lying. He turned to the jury, his voice controlled. We already know the police had another suspect. We already know they ignored him. And now, at the last possible moment, a new witness appears. He let out a slow breath. And the only thing he can say is that he saw my face. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Temple turned back to Douglas. You were coached, weren't you? Douglas blinked rapidly, his face pale. Temple took another step forward, his tone razor-sharp. Who told you to pick me? Douglas shook his head quickly, his fingers gripping the stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one. Temple's gaze didn't waver. You're lying. The courtroom held its breath. Calloway stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness. Judge Hensley raised his gavel. Sustained. His eyes flicked to Temple. Watch yourself, Mr. Carter. Temple inhaled slowly, then took a step back, giving Douglas just enough space to breathe. No further questions. He returned to his seat, the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders. Judge Hensley turned to Calloway. Does the prosecution have anything further? Calloway's jaw was tight. He hesitated before shaking his head. No, Your Honor. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple as he looked over the courtroom. Very well. Both sides will prepare their closing arguments. We reconvene in 1 hour. The gavel struck, and the tension finally cracked as people began to move. Temple remained seated, watching as Calloway hurried over to Douglas, whispering something under his breath. The man looked shaken, his hands still unsteady as he nodded in response. They were slipping. He had forced them to play their last card, and it had failed. But he wasn't done yet. The hour passed in a blur of hushed conversations and restless energy. Temple spent it alone, his thoughts moving like chess pieces. His argument was clear in his head. He knew what had to be said. By the time the courtroom was called back into session, he was ready. Judge Hensley sat forward, his face unreadable. Mr. Calloway, you may begin your closing statement. The prosecutor stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth, practiced. We've spent the last few days dissecting this case. And I want to remind you of one thing. Temple Carter was there that night. The surveillance footage places him in the area. A witness saw him running. The description matched. He paused, his gaze steady. And yes, the defense wants you to question the process. They want you to focus on technicalities. But at the end of the day, common sense tells us the truth. You must ask yourselves, is it possible that all of this evidence is wrong? That every witness, every piece of footage, every officer involved was mistaken? He let the words hang before exhaling. I don't believe so. And I trust that you won't either. With that, he turned and returned to his seat. Judge Hensley nodded. Mr. Carter, your closing statement. Temple stood, adjusting his suit. He walked slowly toward the jury, letting his silence speak before his words did. Common sense, he said finally. That's what the prosecution wants you to rely on. He clasped his hands in front of him. But common sense isn't truth. And this case isn't built on truth. It's built on assumptions. His voice remained steady, but there was fire beneath it. I was arrested because of a vague description. I was charged because of a grainy video. And when the case started falling apart, a new witness magically appeared to say he thought he saw me. Temple turned slightly, looking at each juror individually. If I were white, would I have been arrested at all? The question sat heavy in the air. No one spoke. Temple inhaled. They tell you to trust the system. To believe the police, the prosecutors, the so-called witnesses. But what happens when the system gets it wrong? He glanced toward Calloway. They try to fix it, not by seeking justice, but by making sure someone pays, whether they're guilty or not. He let the words settle before his voice dropped lower. They tried to bury me. And if you convict me, you'll be helping them. Silence. Then, finally, Temple stepped back. The choice is yours. He returned to his seat. Judge Hensley's face remained impassive. The jury will now deliberate. The gavel struck. Temple exhaled slowly. It was out of his hands now. But deep down, he knew. He had done everything he could. And for the first time since this had started, he believed he had a real chance. The jury had been sent to deliberate, and now the waiting began. Temple Carter sat at the defense table, his fingers laced together as he stared straight ahead. He didn't fidget, didn't shift in his seat. On the outside, he was a picture of calm. But inside, his mind was a storm, calculating every possible outcome. He had done everything he could. Exposed the flaws, dismantled the prosecution's case, forced the courtroom to see the cracks in the system. But none of that guaranteed a win. Because the truth wasn't always enough. The jury was out of sight, locked away in a small room somewhere in the courthouse. 12 strangers. 12 people who had been given all the same information but could still come to very different conclusions. Temple had studied cases like this. He knew that deliberations could last hours, sometimes days. But the faster a jury came back, the more likely it was that they had made up their minds long before the trial had ended. That thought sat heavy in his chest. Minutes ticked by. No one spoke. Even Calloway, who had spent most of the trial smugly confident, now sat stiffly at his table, pretending to read through his notes. Judge Hensley had disappeared into his chambers. The courtroom had emptied of spectators. But Temple could feel eyes on him. Across the room, Captain Burke remained seated, arms crossed over his chest. Unlike Calloway, Burke didn't bother pretending to be distracted. His gaze was locked onto Temple with the weight of a man who hated being made to wait. Temple met his stare evenly. He didn't blink, didn't look away. If Burke wanted him to be nervous, he'd have to try harder. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Everyone turned. The bailiff stepped inside, his expression unreadable. The jury has reached a verdict. Temple exhaled slowly. That was fast. Too fast. Judge Hensley returned, taking his seat at the bench with an air of mild exhaustion. He adjusted his glasses, then gave a small nod to the bailiff. Bring them in. The jury filed back into their seats, their faces a mix of tension and unreadable neutrality. Temple didn't look at them. He kept his gaze forward, focused, steady. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let them see fear. The foreman stood, a man in his late 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. He cleared his throat, unfolding a slip of paper. Judge Hensley spoke first. Has the jury reached the unanimous verdict? The foreman nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Temple could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He kept his breathing even, kept his hands still. The foreman inhaled. On the charge of robbery, we find the defendant. A pause. A fraction of a second, but enough to stretch eternity. Not guilty. The words echoed. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, Kess. The courtroom erupted into sound. Murmurs. Guess. The sharp scrape of Calloway's chair as he stood too quickly. A muffled curse from Burke. Temple remained still. His fingers curled slightly against the table, but that was the only sign of tension. Not guilty. Judge Hensley rapped his gavel, calling for order. The noise faded reluctantly. He exhaled. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. Temple stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He turned slightly, catching the jury's expressions, some relieved, some hesitant, some unreadable. Then he looked past them toward Burke. The captain's expression was carved from stone. Not anger, not surprise, just calculation. Temple understood what that meant. Burke wasn't done with him. Temple turned away before the captain could say anything. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction of another stare down. His mother was the first to reach him, pulling him into a tight hug, her hands trembling against his back. Oh, baby, I knew you'd win. I knew it. Temple exhaled, pressing his forehead against her shoulder for just a second. A moment to breathe. A moment to let himself feel something other than sharp-edged focus. He had won, but something about it didn't feel like victory. An hour later, Temple stood in the courthouse steps, breathing in the crisp evening air. The sky had darkened, streetlights flickering to life. Reporters stood nearby, cameras rolling, waiting for a statement. He ignored them. Footsteps approached from behind. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. Calloway stopped beside him, hands in his pockets. You pulled off a miracle in there. Temple didn't respond. The prosecutor exhaled. They weren't supposed to let you walk. Temple turned his head slightly, his gaze sharp. But they did. Calloway studied him for a long moment. You made enemies today. Temple let out a short, humorless laugh. I made them a long time ago. Calloway nodded slightly, as if that answer didn't surprise him. Then, after a beat, he sighed. You're smart, Carter. Smart enough to know that this win doesn't mean you're safe. Temple said nothing. Calloway tilted his head. You were innocent this time. But what happens next time? What happens when they come for you again, and they make sure the case is airtight? Temple finally turned to face him fully. His expression was unreadable. Then I'll be ready. Calloway held his gaze for another long second. Then he let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. Good luck, Carter. He walked away. Temple stood there, watching him go. The city stretched before him, alive with the quiet hum of traffic, of movement, of people who had no idea what had just happened inside that courthouse. He had won, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning.